Story disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction and is intended for entertainment purposes only. The content includes dark themes, horror elements, and fictional depictions of rituals and sacrifices that are purely imaginative and not reflective of any real-life practices or beliefs. Viewer discretion is advised. This video is not suitable for younger audiences, and parental guidance is recommended. The story does not endorse or promote any harmful behavior, violence, or dangerous activities. Please note that all characters, events, and settings are entirely fictional and created for the purpose of storytelling. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. In the bustling African city of Zaria, Kito, an ordinary university student stumbles upon a mysterious ancient book that awakens a powerful force within him. As he becomes entangled with a secret cult known as the Circle, Kito embarks on a dark and thrilling journey to harness his newfound abilities, save his childhood friend Amina, and confront the evil forces threatening their world. Along the way, he discovers allies, ancient secrets, and the true power of love, courage, and sacrifice. Will Kito embrace his destiny and defeat the shadows, or will the darkness consume him? In the bustling African city of Zaria, Kito was just an ordinary university student, or so everyone thought. He was quiet, always in the background, and most of the students never paid him much attention. But Kito had a secret, one that not even his closest friends knew. His life was about to take a dark and twisted turn. It all began on a rainy afternoon when Kito stumbled across an ancient-looking book in a dusty old shop down a forgotten alley. The book had no title, only a strange symbol on its cover that glowed faintly when the rain touched it. Drawn to its mystery, Kito bought the book for a few coins. The shopkeeper, an old man with cloudy eyes, gave him a knowing look but said nothing. Kito rushed back to his small apartment, his heart racing with excitement. As he opened the book, the pages crackled, and a strange, cold breeze swept through the room. The air grew heavy, almost as if the walls were closing in around him. Each page contained symbols and writings in a language Kito had never seen before, but as he stared at them, the words started to make sense in his mind. Suddenly, the room grew dark, and Kito's breath became shallow. He felt a presence behind him, watching, waiting. When he turned, there was nothing there. But he could feel something had changed, something deep inside him. The book had awoken something ancient and powerful. From that night on, Kito's dreams were filled with strange visions, dark rituals, shadowy figures, and whispers that echoed in the deepest corners of his mind. The next day, a group of students approached him. They were unlike anyone he had seen before, their eyes sharp, their movements precise. Without saying a word, they handed Kito a note. The note simply read, "Welcome to the Circle." Kito couldn't shake the unease that settled deep in his chest after receiving the note. The Circle, he thought, rolling the words around in his mind. The note seemed harmless enough, but the way the students looked at him was anything but normal. They had a coldness in their eyes, a strange intensity that sent chills down his spine. Despite his fear, Kito's curiosity was stronger. That night, he found himself wandering the campus, the note clutched tightly in his hand. He couldn't stop thinking about the visions from the night before, the whispers, the shadows, the strange power he felt from the book. Was this all connected? He needed answers, and this circle seemed to be the key. When he arrived at the location written on the note, he found an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of campus. The windows were broken, and vines twisted around the cracked walls. A single light flickered inside, casting eerie shadows across the entrance. Kito hesitated, his pulse quickening. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was one of the students who had given him the note. They wore a dark robe, their face partially hidden by the hood. Without a word, the figure beckoned him inside. The air inside was thick and cold, and the faint scent of something burning filled the room. As Kito walked deeper into the building, he realized there were others. A group of students stood in a circle, each of them wearing the same dark robe. Their faces were obscured, but Kito could feel their eyes on him. He felt exposed, vulnerable, yet he couldn't bring himself to leave. "We've been waiting for you," a voice said, soft but commanding. It came from the center of the circle, where a tall figure stood with their hands raised. The voice was oddly soothing, almost hypnotic, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. Kito's heart raced as the group began chanting, the words low and incomprehensible. The room grew colder, the shadows deeper. Suddenly, Kito felt a sharp pain in his chest, like a hand had reached inside him and was squeezing his heart. He gasped, stumbling backward, but the doors had slammed shut. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the pain vanished. The chanting stopped. The tall figure stepped forward and handed Kito a small object wrapped in cloth. It was warm and pulsing faintly in his hand, as if it were alive. "Welcome to the circle," the figure said. "Your journey has just begun." Kito's hands trembled as he held the warm object wrapped in cloth. It seemed to pulse with life, beating in rhythm with his own heart. He unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing a strange, dark stone. The stone glowed faintly, and its surface was covered in strange markings that seemed to shift and change when he looked at them. "Take it," the tall figure instructed. "It is yours now." The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes locked onto Kito, waiting for him to make his move. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of the building and never look back. But something about the stone drew him in. He couldn't resist. As soon as his skin touched it, a powerful surge of energy coursed through his veins. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Suddenly, he was no longer in the room. Kito found himself standing in the middle of a vast, dark field. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie silver light over the landscape. In the distance, he could see the silhouette of a large structure, shrouded in mist. As he took a step forward, the ground beneath him felt wrong, soft, like it was alive. A low, ominous growl echoed across the field, but there was no animal in sight. Panic surged through Kito, but before he could move, a cold hand grabbed his arm. He whipped around and came face to face with a figure, cloaked in shadow. The figure's eyes glowed a deep red, burning into Kito's soul. "You cannot run from this," the figure hissed, its voice echoing inside his head. "Once you are in, there is no escape." Kito's heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in shallow gasps. The figure's grip tightened, and Kito felt the icy coldness creeping through his skin, freezing him in place. His mind screamed for him to fight back, to do something, but he was paralyzed by fear. Just when it seemed like the darkness would swallow him whole, Kito was ripped back to the present, his body jolting with a violent shock. He was back in the room, gasping for air. The circle members stood around him, watching, their expressions unreadable. "You've seen what lies ahead," the tall figure said, stepping forward. "Now, you must decide. Are you with us, or against us?" Kito's mind raced. His heart still pounded from the terrifying vision, but he couldn't deny the pull of power he had felt. His life had always been ordinary, boring. But now, there was something more, something dangerous and thrilling. Yet, deep inside, a dark warning echoed, this wasn't just a game. Before he could speak, the group closed in around him, their eyes glowing in the dim light. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Kito's breath fought the air. The walls seemed to move, closing in tighter. He could hear whispers again, faint at first but growing louder. They were chanting, their voices overlapping, filling the room with a sinister energy. Suddenly, the stone in his hand grew hot, searing his palm. Kito cried out, but no one moved to help him. The heat intensified until it was unbearable, and just as he thought he would pass out, the stone cooled. "You are bound to us now," the figure said softly, its voice cold and final. "You belong to the circle." The room erupted into shadow as the walls began to twist and flicker. Kito could see strange symbols glowing on the floor, and the faces of the circle members distorted into something inhuman, something monstrous. His stomach churned, and a deep dread settled in his bones. And then, just as quickly as it started, everything stopped. The lights flickered back to normal, the shadows receded, and the circle members were once again just students, standing calmly in their robes. "You'll meet us again tomorrow," the tall figure said, stepping back into the darkness. "And remember, Kito, once you're in, you can never leave." Kito's mind was in turmoil as he left the abandoned building. His hands were still trembling, the weight of the stone burning into his thoughts. He had felt the power, a power that was dark, ancient, and overwhelming. His legs moved on their own as he stumbled through the quiet streets of Zarya, the city lights blurring past him. Nothing felt real anymore. The world around him was still, but inside, Kito was unraveling. Every shadow seemed to watch him, every gust of wind carried whispers he couldn't understand. He had become part of something that defied reason, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. He glanced over his shoulder, but the streets were empty. As he neared his apartment, something caught his eye. The reflection in a shop window showed a figure standing behind him, a tall, cloaked figure with glowing eyes. Kito spun around, but there was no one there. His pulse quickened, a heart pounding in his chest. He was losing control, slipping into a darkness he couldn't escape. He rushed into his apartment, slamming the door behind him. The silence inside felt suffocating. The small room, usually his place of safety, now felt like a prison. He threw the stone onto his desk and collapsed into a chair, trying to catch his breath. But as soon as the stone left his hand, a low hum filled the air. The stone glowed softly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Suddenly, the hum grew louder. The temperature in the room dropped, and a cold wind blew through the cracks in the walls. The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Kito stood up, backing away from the stone, his heart pounding in his ears. Then he heard it, a voice, deep and hollow, echoing through the room. "Kito." The sound made his blood run cold. He spun around, but there was no one there. The voice came again, louder this time, vibrating in his bones. "Kito, you cannot escape." The voice seemed to come from all directions, surrounding him. His breath quickened as panic surged through him. The room began to shift and distort, the walls bending and twisting. Shadows stretched across the floor, creeping toward him like black tendrils. The stone's glow grew brighter, casting eerie light across the room. Suddenly, Kito's body went rigid. He couldn't move. His limbs were frozen in place, as if invisible chains held him down. The shadows grew closer, swirling around his feet. His chest tightened, the weight of terror pressing down on him. The voice came again, but this time, it was inside his head. "You belong to us now." In that moment, Kito felt something snap. It wasn't just fear, it was realization. Whatever he had gotten himself into, it wasn't just a game or some secret group. This was real. The circle had claimed him, and now there was no going back. The shadows wrapped around his legs, pulling him toward the glowing stone. His mind screamed for him to resist, to fight back, but his body refused to move. The air grew thicker, and the room seemed to close in on him. Just as the darkness threatened to consume him, everything stopped. The shadows vanished, the lights flickered back on, and the room returned to its normal state. Kito collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The stone lay on the desk, as silent and still as before. But Kito knew, this was only the beginning. The tension continues to rise, and Kito is now fully aware that he is trapped in something far more terrifying than he imagined. Let me know if this level of intensity and drama is what you're aiming for. I will keep building the suspense and dark twists as we progress through each chapter. Kito's heart hadn't slowed since the night in his apartment. The terror lingered, gnawing at his mind. No matter where he went, the feeling of being watched was inescapable. He barely slept, and when he did, he was haunted by vivid nightmares of the shadows from the circle's ritual, creeping closer, waiting to consume him. He tried to focus on his studies, but it was useless. His thoughts were chained to the stone, now hidden in his closet, but he could still feel its presence, as if it were alive. One night, as he lay in bed, the faint hum returned. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but the sound grew louder. Kito sat up, his eyes scanning the dark room. The hum was coming from the closet. His skin prickled with fear, yet something deep inside urged him to check. He rose from the bed, each step toward the closet feeling heavier, like walking through quicksand. When he opened the closet, the stone was glowing much brighter than before. It vibrated with energy, its eerie light casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. Kito reached for it, but the moment his fingers touched the stone, the room around him vanished. Suddenly, he was standing in a vast, empty plain under a sky as black as night. The air was cold, biting into his skin. In the distance, he saw a figure, tall, cloaked, and faceless, walking toward him. His legs refused to move, as if they were rooted to the ground. The figure grew closer, its footsteps echoing in the silence. Kito, the voice from before whispered, though the figure's lips never moved. You cannot hide from what you are now. The figure raised its hand, pointing toward the ground. Kito looked down, and his blood ran cold. Beneath his feet, the earth was cracking. Thin, black tendrils of shadow curled out from the cracks, wrapping around his ankles, tightening with each passing second. He struggled to move, to break free, but it was useless. The shadows slithered up his legs, cold and suffocating, until they were coiled around his chest. Panic surged through him, but before he could cry out, the ground opened up beneath him, and he was falling. Kito plummeted through the darkness, his scream swallowed by the abyss. The air around him was thick, pressing against his lungs, making it hard to breathe. Just when he thought he would be swallowed whole by the void, he landed with a jarring thud. His surroundings were completely different. He was in a dimly lit chamber, the walls covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly. Kito tried to stand, but his body felt weak, as though the shadows had drained him of his strength. In the center of the chamber stood a large stone altar, and atop it lay a book, the same one he had seen in the bookstore. But this time, its pages were open, and the symbols etched onto them seemed to shimmer and shift. The air crackled with a dark energy, thick and suffocating. Footsteps echoed through the chamber, and Kito's heart raced. From the shadows, the same hooded figures emerged, their faces hidden. They moved silently, forming a circle around the altar, their eyes glowing with the same eerie light. One figure stepped forward, pulling back his hood to reveal a man with sharp features, his eyes glowing the same shade as the stone. You've touched the source, the man said, his voice low and cold. Now, you must prove your loyalty. Kito felt the pressure in his chest build. I didn't ask for this, he gasped. I don't want any of this. The man's lips curled into a sinister smile. It's too late. You made your choice the moment you touched the stone. Suddenly, the shadows in the chamber came alive, slithering toward Kito like living creatures. They wrapped around his wrists and ankles, pulling him toward the altar. His heart pounded wildly, but no matter how hard he struggled, the shadows were too strong. You will serve the circle, the man continued. There is no escape. The power you've tasted is only a fraction of what lies ahead. The shadows lifted Kito onto the altar, pinning him down. He couldn't move, his body frozen in place. The hooded figures began to chant, their voices rising in unison, filling the chamber with a dark, rhythmic hum. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, pulsing in time with the chanting. As the chanting reached a fever pitch, the stone in Kito's pocket began to burn. His skin sizzled, the pain intense. He cried out, but the figures ignored him, their voices growing louder and louder until the entire chamber vibrated with their power. Then, everything went silent. The shadows retreated, and Kito was left lying on the altar, gasping for breath. The man leaned over him, his glowing eyes inches from Kito's face. "You belong to us now," he whispered. "And soon, you will understand why. The stakes have just been raised even higher. The shadows are becoming more aggressive, and Kito is finding himself bound tighter to the circle with no clear way out. The tension and mystery are intensifying. Let me know if this level of intensity is what you want, and I'll continue building from here." Kito jolted awake in his bed, drenched in cold sweat. His chest heaved, heart pounding against his ribs as if trying to break free. He scanned the room, disoriented, but everything seemed normal. The stone was still where he had left it, dull and lifeless on his desk. But the visions, the voices, the shadows, they were all too real to ignore. He wasn't safe. Nowhere felt safe anymore. He pulled himself up, his legs still shaky from the terrifying encounter. He glanced at his phone. It was 3 a.m. The silence of the night only heightened his paranoia. Kito rubbed his face, trying to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. He knew what the circle wanted from him, but he wasn't ready to give in. He didn't sign up for this. Determined to break free from their grip, Kito grabbed his jacket and the stone, stuffing it into his pocket. There had to be a way to stop whatever this was. Maybe someone in Zarya knew about these dark forces, the cult that had taken him in. He remembered the old man who had sold him the book. Perhaps he knew more than he had let on. As he left his apartment, the streets were eerily empty. The city lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to follow his every step. He walked fast, nearly breaking into a run, as he headed toward the old bookstore. His breath fogged in the cool night air, and the silence around him felt unnerving, as if the city itself was holding its breath. When Kito arrived at the store, the shutters were drawn, and the windows dark. He pounded on the door, hoping the old man might still be inside. "Open up," he shouted, desperate. "I need to talk to you." After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open slightly, and the old man's weary face peered out from the shadows. His eyes widened the moment he saw Kito, as though he knew exactly why he was there. "You touched the stone," the old man whispered, his voice trembling. "You shouldn't have done that." "I didn't know." Kito shot back, his frustration spilling over. "What is this thing? What's happening to me?" The old man hesitated, his gaze shifting to the stone in Kito's pocket. "It's not just a stone," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's a key. A key to powers you cannot control." Kito's stomach twisted with dread. "What do they want from me? The circle, what are they trying to do?" The old man's face darkened. "They want your soul. That stone has bound you to their world. Once you've been marked, there's no going back." Kito's mind reeled. His heart raced, a sinking feeling clawing at his insides. "There has to be a way out," he insisted, his voice shaking. "There has to be." The old man sighed, his eyes filled with sorrow. "There is only one way. You have to make a pact. A sacrifice to break the bond." Kito stepped back, alarmed. A sacrifice. He remembered the strange rituals from his visions, the chanting, the shadows, the feeling of being consumed. His blood ran cold at the thought. "Not what you think," the old man clarified. "It's not a sacrifice of life, but a sacrifice of loyalty. You have to confront them. Reject them in their own domain. But that will be dangerous." Kito swallowed hard. His fear gnawed at him, but he couldn't let the circle control him any longer. "How do I do it?" he asked, his voice steady despite the terror swelling inside him. The old man stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come inside. There's much to prepare, and little time." The bookstore's dim light barely cut through the darkness as Kito followed the old man deeper into the back room. Stacks of old tomes, jars filled with strange herbs, and faded parchments cluttered the space. The air smelled of dust and something more, something ancient, like the remnants of forgotten rituals. The old man rifled through a collection of scrolls before pulling out a tattered piece of paper inscribed with intricate symbols. "This is the way," the old man muttered, placing the scroll in front of Kito. "You must go to the place where it all began, the circle's lair. There, you will face them and offer your defiance. But you must be careful. The shadows will try to break you. You cannot show fear." Kito felt a chill crawl down his spine. He was about to enter the darkness again, but this time, it was on his terms. There would be no running. No hiding. It was his only chance to break free from the circle's control. As the old man handed him a small vial filled with an odd, shimmering liquid, Kito's thoughts raced. The fear, the unknown, the threat of losing his very soul, it all weighed heavy on his mind. He was diving deeper into a world where few returned, but he had no choice. This was his only way out. He took a deep breath, gripping the vial tightly. "I'll do it." The old man nodded solemnly. "May the spirits guide you." Kito's heart raced as he stepped back into the night. The vial of shimmering liquid felt heavy in his pocket, like the weight of his choices pulling him deeper into the unknown. The old man's cryptic instructions echoed in his mind, "Go where it all began." That meant the abandoned warehouse at the edge of Zarya, where he had first encountered the circle. The streets were deserted, the city unusually quiet, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Every shadow seemed alive, every gust of wind whispered ominously in his ear. Kito quickened his pace, his mind swelling with thoughts of what awaited him. He was about to confront an ancient force, something far more powerful than he could fathom. Could he really defy them? Would he survive? The warehouse loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding. Its rusted metal walls were half collapsed, vines snaking up the sides like the hands of forgotten ghosts. As Kito approached, he felt the air around him grow colder, and his breath formed misty clouds in front of him. He paused at the entrance, steeling himself. There was no turning back now. He stepped inside. Instantly, the darkness enveloped him. The cold was biting, and the shadows seemed to move, whispering sinister words he couldn't quite make out. Kito pulled the vial from his pocket and uncorked it, the liquid inside glowing faintly in the gloom. The old man had said it would protect him, but it didn't stop the fear from gnawing at his gut. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted even further, and the shadows around him began to shift. They weren't just shadows anymore, they were forms, figures, looming in the periphery of his vision. Kito felt his skin prickle as a low chant filled the air, the same chilling sound he had heard in his visions. "Kito," a voice called out, deep and resonant, as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He froze, his pulse quickening. He knew that voice. It was the leader of the circle, the man who had marked him. A tall figure stepped out from the shadows, his face obscured by a hood. The man's presence was suffocating, the darkness swirling around him like a living thing. More figures emerged behind him, their faces hidden, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You have come to us willingly," the leader said, his voice smooth but cold. "Do you accept your place among us, Kito? Or do you seek to defy what is inevitable?" Kito clenched his fists. "I'm not one of you," he spat, his voice shaking but firm. "I never wanted any of this." The leader chuckled, a low, menacing sound that sent shivers down Kito's spine. "It's too late for that. You've been marked. The stone has bound you to us. You cannot escape your fate. Kito felt the weight of the stone in his pocket, but he pushed down the rising panic. He had to stand his ground. This was his only chance to break free. I won't be your puppet, Kito said, his voice growing stronger. I'm ending this. The leader's eyes gleamed from beneath the hood. You think you can end what has been set in motion for centuries? You are nothing but a pawn in a game far older than you. If you reject us, you reject the power that flows through you. You will be consumed. Without hesitation, Kito reached for the vial and drank the liquid in one swift motion. It burned as it went down, but then, warmth spread through his chest, pushing back the cold. The figures around him recoiled slightly, hissing in displeasure. The leader's smile faltered. You dare defy us, the leader hissed, his voice dripping with malice. Do you even know what you're dealing with, boy? Kito didn't respond. His body pulsed with an energy he had never felt before, a raw, primal force that pushed against the darkness. The shadows seemed to writhe, twisting in on themselves as if something was forcing them back. Enough of this, the leader roared. He extended his hand, and the shadows surged forward, enveloping Kito in a suffocating wave of cold. The air was thick with the sound of chanting, growing louder, more intense. Kito felt the pressure building around him, the darkness pressing in, but the warmth from the liquid held the shadows at bay. He closed his eyes, focusing on the energy within him. He could feel the stone pulsing in his pocket, like it was trying to fight him, but he held firm. I will not bow, Kito whispered through gritted teeth. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like the sound of glass shattering, and the shadows around him exploded outward. Kito gasped as the oppressive darkness lifted, the chanting abruptly stopping. When he opened his eyes, the figures were gone. The leader stood alone in the center of the room, his hood thrown back, revealing his face, pale, gaunt, and twisted with rage. You have made a grave mistake, Kito, the leader spat. You will regret this. But Kito didn't wait for the man to retaliate. He turned and bolted for the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Behind him, the leader's furious roar echoed through the warehouse, followed by the sound of walls crumbling as the building itself began to collapse. Kito burst through the door just as the warehouse caved in behind him, a cloud of dust and debris rising into the night sky. He didn't stop running until he was far away, his lungs burning and his legs trembling. He had done it. He had defied them. But as he slowed to catch his breath, he realized with a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The circle would not let him go that easily. The pact had been made, and now the real battle was about to begin. Kito stumbled through the dark streets of Zarya, his breath ragged. The vial had saved him, but the aftershock left him trembling, as if his body was trying to reconcile with something new that had awakened within him. His hand instinctively moved toward his chest, where a strange heat lingered from the moment he drank the shimmering liquid. But this heat was different, it pulsed, a constant reminder of the power that now coursed through him. As he neared his apartment, the world around him felt different. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore, they seemed to have a life of their own, swirling in the corners of his vision. He could feel them watching him, as if they had grown aware of his presence. His senses were heightened, his skin prickling with every subtle movement in the night air. Kito. The voice whispered his name from the alleyway ahead. He froze. His heart thudded in his chest as he squinted into the darkness. A figure stepped forward, cloaked in a long, dark robe, their face obscured by a hood. It wasn't the leader from before, this presence felt different, less threatening, but still unnerving. Who are you? Kito demanded, taking a cautious step back. The figure tilted their head slightly, a cold smile forming beneath the hood. You've tapped into something far beyond your understanding, Kito. You should have left well enough alone. Kito clenched his fists, a surge of anger and fear rising in him. I didn't ask for any of this. I just want to be free. The figure let out a low chuckle. Freedom is an illusion, boy. You've seen things now that can never be unseen. Do you really think you can walk away from this? Kito's mind raced. He had tasted the power of the circle, but something inside him screamed to break free from its chains. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice edged with frustration. The figure's eyes gleamed from beneath the hood. To offer you a choice. Embrace the power that now flows within you, or face the consequences. Kito's pulse quickened. The darkness inside him, the power he had unleashed, it scared him, but it also intrigued him. Could he control it? Use it for good? Or would it consume him, as the leader had warned? I won't become one of you, Kito said firmly, stepping back. I won't let this power control me. The figure's smile faded, their expression hardening. Then you've made your choice. But remember this, Kito, you are bound to us now, whether you like it or not. With that, the figure dissolved into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Kito stood alone in the empty street, his mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. He had defied the circle, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface of something much larger. That night, Kito dreamt of fire. He was standing in the middle of a vast, burning landscape, the ground beneath his feet scorched and cracked. Above him, a dark sky churned with storm clouds, lightning flashing in the distance. In the center of it all stood a massive, ancient tree, its twisted branches reaching up toward the heavens like gnarled hands. Kito walked toward the tree, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. As he drew closer, he saw that the bark of the tree was blackened, as though it had been burned by some great force. Yet, despite the damage, the tree stood tall, its roots deeply embedded in the earth. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the air, low and menacing. You cannot escape your fate, Kito. The circle has marked you. The power is already inside you. Kito's heart raced as he looked up at the tree. Faces seemed to emerge from the bark, twisted and contorted in pain. Their eyes followed him, pleading for release. No, Kito muttered, shaking his head. I won't let this happen. But the voice only laughed, dark and mocking. You are already one of us. With a jolt, Kito woke up, his body drenched in sweat. His heart was pounding, and his hands trembled as he wiped his face. The dream had felt so real, too real. He could still hear the voice in his head, taunting him. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat up, his mind racing. The circle was inside his head now, infiltrating his thoughts and dreams. He couldn't let this continue. He needed to find a way to sever the connection, to rid himself of the mark they had placed on him. But how? With the circle inside Kito's head, infiltrating his thoughts and dreams, will he be able to break free? Join us on the next episode to find out.